Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Shane and I'm delighted to be joined by Thurupathan Vijayakumar, Chief Technology Officer, Aventude in Sri Lanka, who will be talking to you today about democratizing the Azure governance and security. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC20. Remember to check out the Resource Center. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com and click the content link at the top. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you have in the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Center, where you'll be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter, Thurupathan Vijayakumar. Hello, Thurupathan.
Hi.
Hi, Thurupathan. You can hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you, Rio.
Can you hear me? I can indeed. I'm just going to make you a presenter now, so just bear with me here for 1 moment. Okay, Thurupathan, so take it away.
Hello, everyone. So welcome to the webinar to discuss about democratizing Azure governance and security. So thank you for attending, and I'm Thurupathan Vijayakumar, CTO of Aventude. This section particularly leading about the governing issues of Azure for companies and enterprises and also managed service providers. So if you really look at a scenario like where you see yourself as a CIO or a IT administrator of an organization, when using cloud, you will have two folds of decisions that we have to make. One is enabling users with the possibilities of the cloud with less friction, and the other side, you have to be concerned about doing it more securely, and we have to prevent the cloud sprawl, meaning like doing with the right cost-effective way, and also make sure the resources and the policies and everything happens in cloud is adhering to your organizational security and standards. So this is two sides of the parameter. So we always want to give a good user experience for the users, developers, and external stakeholders. But at the same time, there is a concern about doing it more secure. So just to start this context, we will begin with Azure Active Directory, because Azure Active Directory is the primary service or an entity to govern security across all the Azure related access control and also extended capabilities, which we will look at this webinar. So first, we have to understand Azure Active Directory. The biggest concern in understanding Azure Active Directory is the name Azure Active Directory implies it as part of an Azure service, but technically it lives outside an Azure service. So when in Microsoft documentations and terminology, tenant mean an Azure Active Directory. So if you are an organization who's using O365 services, who have a license, so you are enjoying the O365 emails and other office services, you technically have an Azure Active Directory, even though you are not explicitly using any Azure services. That is because the identity mechanism of Office 365, Azure subscription, and also some services like Microsoft Intune all are coupled with Azure Active Directory. So if you are a O365 administrator of your organization, and you will have access to your admin center. So in your admin center, as you can see in the image, under the admin centers, you will have an option called Azure Active Directory. So when you click that, you will be taken to a portal. That portal URL will be aad.portal.azure.com. A typical Azure portal URL is portal.azure.com. So this is specifically targeting the Azure Active Directory service for you. So here you will see the same number of users, the same users that you provision in O365, and you can control the password reset policies, MFA, and other organizational sign-in policies here. But you use Azure Active Directory in this mode as an IAM part for your organization. So far, we are not using Azure services. We are only using O365 services. That means we have O365, but we don't have any virtual machines or web services or none at all. We are using Azure, and also we are not paying for any Azure services. We are only paying for O365. So in this case, now see that now your organization wants to go to Azure Cloud, and then you want to spin up some workloads in Azure Cloud. So the first thing, you need to procure an Azure subscription. So Azure subscription is the least level billable entity in Azure. So you can procure Azure subscription in many ways, but assume that you acquire a subscription directly using your credit card as a web direct pay, or maybe through a partner, then you will get an Azure subscription for you. So now, if you look at the previous picture, you already have the O365 and associated Azure Active Directory, and then your Azure subscription will be attached to the same Azure Active Directory. So under one tenant, meaning under one Azure Active Directory, you have your O365 service, which you will be paying for your O365 licenses, and also you have an Azure subscription where you will be utilizing Azure consumption and you will be paying for it. So as a sysadmin of an organization, as this slide explained, as a sysadmin of Aventude, so when a sysadmin logins to the admin center of O365, he can manage all the O365 related settings. And when we go to the portal.azure.com, since this subscription is attached to the same Azure Active Directory, he can manage the Azure resources as well. But this is not the case always, because organizations sometimes miss to attach the subscription to the same tenant, or purposely they want to have a different Azure Active Directory for the Azure consumption and a different Azure Active Directory for their organizational user management. So there could be a scenario like there will be two Azure Active Directories or more than two for an organization. In this particular way of looking, when the same Azure subscription is attached to the Azure Active Directory, sysadmin of Aventude can add other users to the subscription. Since all the users are stored in the same Azure Active Directory, it's a matter of assigning them to the subscription. Also, external users will be invited by the invitation. So it's about all the users in O365 will be there, and sysadmin will be assigned who has access to Azure subscription. So it's simple. In scenario 2, as I explained, whereas O365 service is attached to one Azure Active Directory and your Azure subscription is attached to a different Azure Active Directory. So in this case, those are totally two separate Azure Active Directory instances. They don't know each other. So in this scenario, if sysadmin of Aventude wants to include a user to their Azure subscription, they will simply invite them. So they will type the email address of the user through at aventude.com, and then we'll fire up the invitation, and the user will get the invitation and he'll click on and he will sign into the new Azure Active Directory. But the catch is, when the user get the invitation and when he's going to click accepting the invitation, the authentication still happens where the real user is. So in this case, the real user is in the Azure Active Directory, which has the O365. That means where the user is in. That's the real tenant of the user. The other tenant is just inviting me, and I'm just accepting the invitation, and I'm getting assigned to that directory. So mostly this is sometimes a preferred scenario. For example, if the two billing scenarios are managed separately, whereas O365 of an organization and Azure of an organization, and you want to have two different administrators for these two scenarios. And sometimes it happens mistakenly that when during the procurement of the process, the people miss to associate the subscriptions. So it is a very important thing for the IT administrators and the C-level people where which information stays, in which Active Directory my user accounts and my user policies are there, in which Azure Active Directory associated subscription the workloads are there. Sometimes we come across certain scenarios whereas people deploy applications in the Azure. Say, for example, in a scenario like you have two Azure Active Directories and you are deploying an application with a single sign-on capability in the second in the Azure. So on the right side, we have the Azure. Say the application is running on Azure App Service and it needs a single sign-on capability. But when you enable that, for the right tenant ID, we have to input the O365 Azure Active Directory, because that is where the authentication happens. Though the deployment is in the subscription attached to a different Azure Active Directory. We very commonly face this situation, whereas during the dev and the test process, the application runs smoothly, but when they deploy, it breaks, or maybe they don't see all the users, or the permissions is not shared, because when during the dev and the test process, they are using the Azure's tenant ID, and during the production, they have to point to the right directory where the real users are. So your configurations and the tenant IDs, object IDs, and all these setups should rely on the right tenant in order to get this application work. So this is one of the common scenarios, either by accident or either by purpose. If you have multiple Active Directories for your organization, you need to be aware what are the tenant IDs, which subscriptions or which users attached to where. So that's something of a common scenario. So with that understanding, if we look into the governance of Azure, we have Azure Active Directory and a subscription. So we can have multiple subscription below one tenant or below one Azure Active Directory. So just before 1 year back, this is the typical picture. There is a AAD and we have multiple subscriptions. So each subscription, as it was mentioned earlier, it is the billing unit. So you can assign owners and you can assign budget caps for subscriptions, and you can manage. But this structure is not always helpful in structuring and governing bigger organizations, whereas when an organization have huge number of use cases like that, you have department specific budgets. So you want to assign department specific administrators, or maybe you are a large group of company, and whereas different companies under your group want to have different administrators, or maybe you have a centralized IT and certain parts of this being outsourced to someone. So this structure doesn't necessarily help, because it's only two-way structure. We have Active Directory and then we have subscriptions. So Microsoft introduced something called management groups in between Azure Active Directory and the subscriptions. So management groups are just elements to structure the hierarchy of an organization in the Azure way. In order to do the management group, the global administrator should have use access management privilege, and then you can create hierarchies between the Azure Active Directory and the subscription. It is enabled by policies and blueprints. Policies and blueprints are templates which you deploy to management groups or subscriptions in order to ensure controls. So we will look at a demo on how to do that. Before going to the demo, so when we introduce management groups, this is how it will be. So under the Active Directory, you can have a management group or a subscription. Management group can have another management group under that. So that hierarchy can be literally unlimited as long as the final point you stop at the subscription, and once you stop the subscription, inside the subscription we create resources and the workloads there. So in between a subscription and the top level root management group or top level Azure Active Directory, we can have any number of management groups. So policies are the documents actually we specify at a management group level or at a subscription level as what we allow and what we don't allow within that hierarchy. So from a single organization point of view, this would be a structure that you can use. You can have a centralized IT, and you can have management groups for departments. So finance, HR, sales, and under the departments, you can have furthermore management groups, or maybe you can have subscriptions. A typical scenario is people use subscriptions for dev and test and production, or maybe sometimes different subscriptions for different projects. So there are different scenarios how you work and also how you enable your the structure in the organization. And beyond everything, you can have subscriptions still directly under the root management group. So that's the example that you can see on the right side. The core system, sometimes the central IT managers, they can either have an IT management group or they still directly have it under the root management group. Another scenario is like you have an offices all around the world and you have a centralized IT, and then you geographically distribute your hierarchy. So this is like a free thing how we plan the organizational structure and how we can reflect. So, and how we can group the cost, how we can separate the policies, the governance structure, security, and everything. Earlier on a flat structure, it was not possible because we have to either put the policies and the costing and everything into one bucket, which is the subscription, or otherwise we have to apply everything at a resource group level. So now we'll see how we can use the Azure blueprints and Azure policies to create some controls. So I'm in my Azure dashboard. So first, there are two things. One is the Azure blueprints. Azure blueprints are the containers where we assign policies, RBAC controls, and other services as a folder, and then we assign those blueprints to the relevant management groups and subscriptions. Say, for example, what we can do with Azure policies. Say that you want to have a control over the resources created in Azure. Say you want to put a control to your development team that they can only create resources of specific sizes, so you can prevent any unnecessary costing. Some developer will not accidentally fire a big virtual machine and then it adds up cost. Also that you can put a compliance rule that you have to create resources only in one geographical locations. So these things can be done. So you have to go to Azure and policy. So you can see this is one of our dev subscriptions. So these are applied security compliances. So I can see like these are not compliant and based on the policy which have been already inbuilt and applied by Azure. If I want to create a new policy, let's say that I want to create a policy for one of my departments to restrict them from creating bigger workloads. Maybe they are a small dev team, so I just want to restrict them. Okay, they should create only certain number of VMs. So let's search SKU. So you can see there is already an inbuilt policy called allowed virtual machine size SKUs. So simply I can duplicate that, and I can apply where I'm going to apply this. I'm going to apply to a specific management group or a specific subscription. Let's say I'm going to assign to one of the subscriptions. So that is where my developers are working. I apply, and I'll just rename small template or something. I'll save it. So that's available now. So search that. So this is the template I created. So I'll go to the template. I go there, and then I can click assign. And when I'm clicking assign, so these are the information is already there. I can put a comment when assigning it. I can put who is assigning. By default, it's my login username is picked. And here is the parameter. So I'm going to allow them, okay, they can create only VMs of A1 and A1V2. So these are the only allowed SKU sizes or VM sizes they can create if I apply that policy to the subscription. So we don't need to worry about cloud sprawl. Someone is spinning up a huge service and it's running day and night, and you get a big bill. And then and you can pass it over the manager identity, and then you create the assignment. So once this assignment has been done, the clone of this policy template is being assigned to that subscription, and the users will be restricted to create VMs. So as you noticed earlier, there are other templates, like I can specify location, I can restrict the location, allowed locations. So what are the locations I want to create, typically in which region I want to create the resources. So someone will not create resources accidentally somewhere far away from your customers, so unnecessary workloads. So when we create these policies, so we can bundle these different policies. Say there is a location policy, there is a policy for your SKU sizes, and there is a policy for what is the throughput of a maximum database tier. Say that we have number of policies, and now we want to assign it as a bundle. So we create that under the Azure Blueprints. So Azure Blueprints is a collection of policies and resource templates. So here I have a couple of blueprints. So if you really click here, so you can see this blueprint has two policies assigned. One is the size of the VMs, and also the most interesting part is, like, if you go back to the blueprint screen, so you can create a blueprint from a predefined set of Azure templates. So we can start from a blank blueprint where I can select the policies I created earlier and assign them, or else, say if you are deploying a workload which you need ISO 2017 specification. So you can, these are predefined compliance ready templates. So they impose what is the encryption scheme should be there, or how the user control access should be enabled, and how the users should communicate, and the VNet structures. So these are created based on these well-known compliance like HIPAA, ISO, SQL workload. So then we can pick one of the most compliant template, and we can apply it to the subscription. So whatever the resources been created, for example, if one significant compliance says any user authentication should have an MFA for a specific compliance, once we apply that, developers or anyone cannot create a user without MFA. So this is a very good tool to monitor the compliances and your organizational policies at the central place. You will have the flexibility either to deny or allow them. So once if it is not allowed, as you showed seen earlier, you will have a compliance dashboard as well. Okay, these are the compliance violations happening. Say you can see out of this, I have 21 non-compliance. So there are 21 actions have been taken place in this particular tenant or in this particular subscription, which has violated the compliance requirement. And we can go to the details, and we can see what is that, and also Azure will suggest you how to fix that compliance violation, either by enabling the service or what is the resource associated with the compliance. So these are mostly the audit compliance. So as you can see, some of the SQL workloads are running without auditing policies enabled. This is a development subscription, so it is not mandated here, but still it has allowed the developers to create the resources without the audit policies, but still it is showing as a non-compliant. But as a assignee of a policy, you can decide how you want to imply your policies. You can either allow and make it as a warning, something like this, or else you can totally put a hard policy saying without that particular compliance is made, you cannot create any resources. So this is a highly used service in Azure, and most of the organizations, enterprises are trying to adapt this. And also when the security and the compliance is one of the increasing concern, this is being governed. Earlier, in Azure, this governance was not this simplified. We have to go to individual resources, individual resource groups, and check the policies. Here, once you create a policy, as we saw earlier, you have to apply where we want which policy to be applied. Technically, the policy is inherited from the one in the top, but there are, when you create a policy, you can create conditions that if you want to specifically override one condition which is coming from the parent policy. But the default behavior is it inherits the high-level policy. Another important scenario of today's discussion is how managed service providers can handle the Azure governance. This is whether you are a managed service provider, meaning that you provide Azure services as a consultation or Azure development, or even if you are a customer who is at the consuming end, that how we can securely manage the access. For example, you are a organization, you are working with a supplier, maybe a couple of their consultants, so they need access to your Azure environment for the period of time, say till the project ends. Or maybe you have a contract, an AMC contract with someone, and so the service providers and their employees will connect to your Azure account and they will do their managed service operations. So how we can enable those scenarios without losing control of identity and the governance. So typically, it is normally done in two ways. One is, let's assume Aventude Digital is the company which is the customer who is expecting a service from a company called Aventude Ops. So Bob is the backup operator, or he's a service guy from Aventude Ops company, and he is going to offer services to Aventude Digital. So the first scenario is Bob is invited to the Aventude Digital tenant. So in this case, Aventude Digital sysadmin create a guest user or just type the email of Bob's email and send an invitation, as we saw in the earlier scenario, and Bob accepts that invitation and he gets access to the allowed resources. So what are the resources he's getting access inside Azure is determined by the role-based policies, or RBAC policies determined by the Aventude Digital sysadmin. So still, Bob is authenticated with his Azure Active Directory. So his password policies, MFA policies, everything relies with his company Azure Active Directory. For example, if his company is not using MFA, and if someone steals his password, there is a possibility that your resources are exposed to them. The second, so this, as you see, Bob is a belongs to a service providing company. So he is not only going to work with Aventude Digital, so he will be working with many customers. So with the same credentials, he will have access to many Azure Active Directory tenants. So on a typical screen of a Bob, when he logs into his portal.azure.com using his credentials, so he will see all the directories in the drop-down as who has invited him. So he can click on the right directory and he can go inside the resources and he will do the job. So this is the most commonly used setup now. you invite your external consultants to your tenant. Second approach is you create a temporary user account for Bob in your tenant. So Bob, you create a temporary user account in your tenant. So Bob's tenant is not in the considerable vicinity, so this is totally not related. So you create a new username and you create a password for Bob and you give it to Bob. So he will use it till the project ends. So mostly when you do this, sysadmins forget to disable some password policies, or sometimes they forget to remove the user when the project is finished. So there is a high probability the Bob is left there in your tenant. Sometimes you may be even paying licenses for him with access to your resources. And also from a Bob's point of view, again, he is going to work with many customers. So he's going to receive a pair of credentials, a username and a password from different customers, and he will be having a notepad like this on his desktop. So mostly these scenarios, they create a common password. After you give the password, they create a common password and use it across all their customers, unless you disable the password policies. So both these scenarios are having their all vulnerabilities and the friction in the user experience, either for the customer or either for the managed service provider. So Azure introduced a service called Azure Lighthouse. So Azure Lighthouse is a service just to facilitate this scenario in a more robust way without giving more control to each other, and also having the way to visibly access without switching tenants or without switching the credentials. So the building blocks is built on 3 layers. The bottom layer is Azure Delegated Resource Management. That is, you're delegating resource management. That is exactly, I'm giving access to a consultant of my resource. So how this delegated resource management is going to work based on the AAD principles. And on top of it, the cross-tenant management and the portal experience is built. So we want to do this through the Azure portal. So it's user-friendly, and this is a cross-tenant management scenario. Actually, this case can be even extended, not only from a service provider and the customer point of view. Even if you have a group of companies where your IT team is separated from other companies, so that you need to still want to establish strict policies within your organizational boundary. So you can use Azure Lighthouse even for that purpose. On top of it, the third layer is extended scenarios. That is for marketplace and the business applications. For example, if you are a service provider and you provide services for SAP management or Kubernetes management, so in that case, you can publish your offers. You can publish your offers, and all around the people can see your service into the marketplace window, and they can subscribe. So that is a business extended scenario, which I will skip in this presentation to cover it, because in order to enable that, you should have some manual setups to be done with your local Microsoft provider. But from technical point of view, let's see how Azure Lighthouse works and how this experience is managed. So in the first scenario, we are not going to look at the publishing scheme through the global Azure Lighthouse providership. That means you are not publicly available in the marketplace as a service provider, but I want to tell my customers, my private customers, to use Azure Lighthouse to enable me. So that is called private publishing. So in the private publishing, there is a separate tenant identification that we have to do. So if you look at, if you are a managed service provider, you use a template like this. This is a predefined template, which is from Azure. So this template, you have to give it to your customers. In our case, Aventude Ops will give this to Aventude Digital. So first, Aventude sysadmin has to run this template using the PowerShell to their tenant. So this is a template. So this is a standard fixed template. So if you are a service provider, what we need to fill in this template is the primary question. So we provide the parameters through another JSON file. So in this context, I am the Azure Ops Service Company. So I have provided my service name, and maybe I have a lot of offerings, and this particular offering I will name it Aventude Gate Service Management Gold Tier. So this is, I'm going to manage, name my service bundle. This is just a brand name for my service. And this is the tenant ID of Aventude Ops. That means this is Bob's tenant ID, that he can get it from there. And this is the important section. So this is the authorization I am requesting from my customer. I'm requesting, these are the permissions I need from your tenant. So in order to do that, I can request multiple authorizations, as you can see in this template. In this JSON, I have used 2 authorization requests. In each authorization request, I have to specify 3 parameters. First is the principal ID, then the principal display name, and the role definition. Principal ID is what or to whom I am requesting this permission to. So switching back to the presentation, here things get a little more technical and a little more complex. In an Azure Active Directory context, there are 2 principles we can create. One is a user principal, other one is a service principal. User principal is a user. Typically, you create a user object and it becomes a user principal. And service principal is a service authentication scheme that you create. Say, for example, you are creating a AAD service principal in order for some API to authenticate with another API. So it's a service, another service is going to use that service principles. So in that case, in a user principles, we get a username and a password, which will be used by the real user. Whereas in a service principal, you get a service principal ID and a service principal secret, which is in turn act as a password. So service principals have many types of registration principals, managed identities, and they have another 2 more types. So those are not the important part for the context of this discussion. So we will focus on the first 2. So there are 2 principles, one is user principal and a service principal. So going back to my JSON template, here it commonly says principal ID. So when you give this to a customer, the customer has no way to know which principal this is. Is it a real user behind this, or is it a service? In fact, actually, there is no way to specify that to a customer, because the customer doesn't worry. What he is mostly worried about is the role definition ID, the third one. So in this case, I am using the first one is associated with the user. This is the object ID of Bob. So in this case, he is the real user. And this is the username, how you want to show Bob in customer's tenant. So you can give a name, maybe service manager 1 or anything. Role definition is what is the permission you are requesting from the principal? What is the exact permission you are requesting? So it is a GUID, you can see. So these GUIDs don't say whether you are requesting an owner permission or a contributor permission or whatever. But normally we request a permission which we are familiar with those terms. So how those terms are mapped with these GUIDs, that is basically Microsoft has published a list of permissions. So in this page, you can see, say if I am going to request a contributor permission, this is the ID. So this is technically a hard-coded thing, fixed GUID for the contributor role in Microsoft. If you are going to get a contributor role permission, you have to use this. So maybe they may change the names and change the descriptions. So these IDs are hard-coded. So this page, you can get all the IDs for all the different permissions that you can request. So I come to this page and I know what's the permission I need, and I copy the correct ID and I put it here. So the combination of these 3 things is one authorization request. So with these three, I know whom I am giving to that permission, either to a user or to a service. What is the permission I am requesting, and principal display name is the name that we see it in the portal. So in this case, I am requesting permissions for two different entities. In this case, the first one is the real user, and the second one I'm using it for a service. Say, for example, I'm going to use a batch operation from my tenant to my customer's tenant to take a backup. So the user is not going to manually log in and take the backup. So my service is going to talk to the customer's tenant and do that backup. So my service will have an object ID like this. So for a customer's point of view, it's just the access. He doesn't need to worry about what is given. So we get this template downloaded. This is a fixed template from Microsoft, and we fill the parameters. And if we need more authorization, we just fill up these arrays, and then we pass these two JSON files to the customer. So going back to the presentation, we pass these two to the customer. In this case, the Bob will give that two JSON templates to the sysadmin of Aventude Digital, and Aventude Digital sysadmin will run a PowerShell script to execute those two JSONs. So once those two JSON files have been executed, there is a link between these two disconnected Azure Active Directories will be created for those specific objects which are identified by the principal IDs. So for one user object and one service object, the links established between these Azure Active Directories. So coming back, once this has been enabled, if you are a managed service provider, then after the enabling has been done, if you go to the Lighthouse, Azure Lighthouse, you can see under your customers, you can see one customer has been enrolled, and you can click the customer name, customer ID I have highlighted because it reveals the real tenant ID, and the offer ID, it says no marketplace offer because it is an offer we created manually through the PowerShell. As I mentioned earlier, it's a private publishing mode, and the delegations is it what we can see what the delegations the customers have given. Technically, these are the delegations we requested the customer through the JSON file, unless the customer have made any changes to that. And also, if you are the customer, you will see under the same Lighthouse instance, when you log into your portal, under the service provider offer section, you can see, okay, I am now getting the service from Aventude Op Service Company. There is one service I am getting, and that's a service provider name, and I can go to this subscription and I can see what other permissions I have provided. And as a customer, I can simply come and I have this dashboard, and we can set alerts to this dashboard. And if one company is still relying there, we can just simply delete it as soon as the project is over. So there is no hassle of going through all the users and seeing who is from which company and cleaning the Azure Active Directory, which is nearly impossible after running many services with a lot of external people. So this is a friendly user experience for both the managed service providers and also for the customers from Azure delegation plane point of view. So we have reached the end of the session. So if you really look at the context that actually we started building was how and what are the features actually we can use in Azure in order to democratize the governance and make sure you give access and you give enablement to your users, your partners, your consultants without blocking and having many calls going here and there. Can you enable the permission, give me that permission, and also you do that with the most securely cost effective way, and also with the more cost controlled way for large organizations. But if we look at all these three scenarios, one is enabling Azure Active Directory in the O365 setup, and enabling management groups and moving and arranging subscription, and or the last scenario, empowering managed service providers and the customers. These three scenarios can be possible only if there is a Azure Active Directory plane which lives outside the boundary of Azure and O365. So this is one of the very common challenges and the misunderstanding most of the ops people, the IT people, and the developers make. That's because the name Azure implies they feel it is part of inside Azure. The Azure Active Directory is a global plane which controls the entire IAM. So as we see, if I'm creating a connection with a customer tenant, the connection is made within two Active Directories at a logical level, and then they are reflected in the subscription of 365. So from an architectural point of view, Azure Active Directory is another separate IAM plane which controls the entire access controls and access policies of both O365 and Azure services. Based on the tier SKU, different Azure Active Directory logical separations, and also different services can be added or removed as like which kind of Azure Active Directory service you subscribe to, the 365 one, free one, or premium one, or premium 2 one. But from an operational point of view, they totally live outside the scope of both 365 and Azure. So that's the end of the presentation. I'm glad to have your questions and answer them.
Thank you for a great presentation. Yes, now we will start the questions and answers part. And should you wish to ask a question, please type it into the questions window now. Okay, Thurupathan, here is question number 1. Is it possible to rearrange existing subscriptions with new structure with management groups?
Yes, it's Azure provides both the GUI-based and the PowerShell-based scripts to rearrange the existing subscription because management groups was introduced later, but mostly the planning needs to be done upfront because we need to decide which kind of organizational structure, which kind of a billing structure is needed for a company. And once that whiteboarding session is done, then it's a matter of practically doing it. So existing movement is possible.
Okay. Next question. What is the cost associated with Azure Lighthouse service?
Azure Lighthouse service is free. So because it's an enablement between two Azure Active Directories, so whether you are a customer or a managed service provider, you can use it for free.
Okay. And the last question we have so far, what is the difference between Azure Lighthouse and Azure Arc?
Azure Lighthouse works within the Azure boundary, and it is primarily made for first tenant management. But Azure Arc works on a polycloud scenario. For example, you want to manage the resource running outside Azure. It could be on-prem or even it could be on AWS. So it's sort of more than first tenant, it's first cloud management. It's
super.
It's than Azure Lighthouse.
Okay. Well, on behalf of the ESPC community, thank you, Thurupathan, for taking the time today to complete this webinar. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Brilliant. Okay, everybody, this is the end of today's webinar. Thank you for joining us today, and please do join us for more upcoming webinars. Full details are available at sharepointeurope.com. This webinar, along with all other episodes, will be added to the Resource Center, which can be viewed at sharepointeurope.com/resource-center. Again, a massive thank you to our webinar presenter today, Thurupathan Vijayakumar, and thank you as well for joining us. Take care and goodbye.